Hi, Johan. This is Ira, and I am recording here my audio feedback on your statement of belief. My aim is to share some thoughts on the statement of belief that will be useful to you as you are revising your larger major essay for the course, the Defining Good Arguments in Digital Context essay. And I want to say right off the bat, one of the things I really like about this essay, this statement of belief, I think it's really nice. You very thoughtfully worked your way through a series of definitions and subparts of definitions that I think stand you in really good stead. So I think that's really cool. So what I'm going to do here is kind of go through and ask you a few questions that, again, like I said, I hope you'll find useful as you're working on the larger theoretical piece. So basically, your core definition, an argument is a series of statements that one uses to convince others. And so a series of statements that one uses to convince others. But not just any kind of statements. They're statements that involve reasons and some conclusion. Something that you're trying to convince others of and some reasons that you're giving for that. You further specify, saying a good argument, though, is not just that, but also is specifically rational and logical. The conclusion is logical, and the reasons given are rational. And this has the result that the argument is able to withstand questioning and serves its primary purpose, which is to persuade without the use of emotional appeals. And that's a really interesting way of defining good argument. And I'm curious about that. Why is it bad to include emotional appeals in your judgment? And I'm not saying that you should think differently, but rather I'm interested in pushing you on that a little bit, because most people would say that some form of arguments can be good with emotional appeals. And so you've excluded that right from the start here, and I'm interested to know more like why that is and what's at stake in that for you. So, when you break down reason, you offer three requirements that count to make reasons good. They're relevant, i.e. they're relevant to the conclusion, to the argument. They're accurate, they're truthful or correct, and they're sufficient. They're enough. So they suffice or are adequate to arrive at the conclusion in some way. And I'm going to push you a little bit more on sufficiency. I want to know a little more whether you are requiring sufficiency in like the logical philosophical sense of necessary and sufficient conditions, or if you have something else in mind. So the reasons need to be relevant. And what you're saying makes them relevant is that they're straightforward and they draw a clear line around the topic. They have obvious relationships with the conclusion. I wonder, what about reasons that, although they don't have an obvious relationship with the conclusion, they do kind of help move a person toward the conclusion over time? Are those acceptable in your view, and why or why not? And I think the notion of irrelevant reasons being bad, that seems sort of prima facie correct, and I certainly don't dispute that. And I like your description here of why that's bad. It fails to find the connection. It fails to help a person connect the reason and the conclusion, which makes it harder for a reader or an audience to follow the logic of the argument, and opens more space for disagreement about the conclusion. Now, with regard to accuracy, I'm interested in your definition. So you define accurate reasons as those that can withstand questioning from others. A good argument should provide the audience with accountable reasons, which I love. I love this way of thinking that accuracy isn't necessarily the same as precision, but rather it's about accountability. And I'd like to hear more about what you see as the relationship between accountability and factuality. How are factuality and accountability related? At the same time, I kind of want to challenge you a little bit, because you say it should exclude any personal opinions, interpretations, or assumptions. And I think one of the things that I hope is clear from the way that we talked about enthymemes and becoming enthymetic with Aristotle is that's impossible. There's no, you can mathematically exclude personal opinions or interpretations, or even then you can't really exclude assumptions. That's what axioms are. So how do you account in your thinking of accuracy for the unavoidability of some interpretation or some assumption? How does your definition of good argument respond to that unavoidability? Even, for instance, using the information in newspapers can be very opinionated information. You can get partial information. It often involves many interpretations or assumptions. So I kind of want to press you a little bit on this notion of accuracy and how accuracy works. I love the idea that accuracy is about accountability, but I'm a little skeptical, or at least curious to hear you say more about how you would get at this way of thinking about accuracy, and if you can't, then what you would do instead. Now, when you talk about sufficiency, again, you're not, I like you articulate clearly, you're not saying it has to have lots of arguments. You're saying it's about the quality of argument, that it's about offering the audience reasons that contain adequate information for arriving at a complete understanding of the subject. And yet, at the same time, a complete understanding? I mean, that's a lot to ask, right? By that definition, it would seem that almost all of our arguments are bad, because we rarely, about any topic, really develop a complete understanding. And so I think for thinking about sufficiency, it's always important to think about, so what constitutes a complete enough understanding by this measure? When will we know whether we've offered enough arguments to allow somebody to arrive at a complete understanding, or enough reasons? Also, at the same time, I think it's really interesting to ask, so is helping an audience understand the subject always an important part of persuasion, or not? When is it not? What does it look like when that doesn't happen? We would think about a lot of cases of propaganda, for instance, sort of rely on people not really understanding things very well. And what's the relationship between those moments where we can't understand things perfectly and those moments where we're deliberately obfuscating or deliberately obscuring a completer understanding? Ultimately, then, I think I want to think a little bit more too. I want to ask you to think a little bit more about this notion of the quality of the conclusion. I love it. It needs to be logical and clear. Fair enough. I'm sold. And you make a distinction between like a conclusion as a piece of writing and a conclusion as something that an argument arrives at. It's a claim deduced from reasons. It should be the outcome of logical inferences. And I think I'd like to hear you say a little bit more about what you mean by logical inferences, given the above, given the ways in which interpretations sneak in or assumptions slip by. There are always unstated premises, Aristotle tells us. Finally, then, I think this idea that the purpose of an argument, it's a sole purpose, it's persuasion. Convey and convince the audience with its idea. And I can buy that. I have no problem with that. I love the way that you distinguish arguing from quarreling. Also, though, I kind of want to challenge you a little bit on this. Are some arguments designed not so much to push somebody else to a determined conclusion, but rather to figure out what the arguer themselves thinks or believes? Might it sometimes be useful to perform an argument with another person, not in order to persuade them, but rather in order to try on something that's going to help you decide what you think is true? If not, why not? If so, how does that affect this argument, this way of thinking? And I think here you have a very narrow definition of emotional appeals. And I wonder, what about emotional appeals that don't involve pressuring or forcing, but that are part of the reasons themselves? So, for instance, when we're talking about refugees at the border, people seeking asylum at the border of the U.S. One of the arguments that people often make is, well, but you should care about these people. And that's an emotional appeal, right? It's not strictly rational. There's nothing strictly rational that says we should ever care about each other. We care because we have some kind of emotional connection or bond. And when we do, then, isn't that after all an emotional appeal? And don't we want that sometimes? Or do we never want it? And so if we want it sometimes, how does that change the definition? And if we never want it, why? Why not? Why would it always be bad? So I think those are some questions that I hope, as you're completing your final hours of work on the Defining Good Argument in Digital Contexts essay, that these questions will prove useful. I really enjoyed reading this, and I'm looking forward to reading more of your work soon. Thanks. Bye.